The lawyer set his briefcase down on my grandmother's dining table, right where she used to serve Sunday pot roast every single Sunday for as long as I could remember, and he said something I will never forget for as long as I live. "Before I read the will," he said, looking directly and steadily at my sister, "I need to show everyone in this room something Eleanor specifically asked me to keep sealed until today." My sister's face went the color of old paper, drained and papery and still, in a way I had never once seen on her before that afternoon. I want to back up because you need to understand exactly what led to that moment, the moment my grandmother's lawyer, a quiet, unremarkable man named Alan Pierce who had drafted 3 wills for our family over 20 years and never once raised his voice at a client, stood at the head of that table and in for calm sentences, undid 6 months of lies. 6 months before that afternoon, my sister Vanessa hadn't spoken to our grandmother in almost 2 full years. Not a single phone call. Not one birthday card. Nothing at all. And then, out of nowhere, she showed up at Nana's door with a bouquet of grocery store carnations, and an announcement that changed everything in our family overnight. She was pregnant. I remember exactly where I was standing when I found out, in Nana's kitchen, drying dishes, the same kitchen I'd been standing in almost every weekend for 3 years while I helped my grandmother manage her medications, her doctor's appointments, her slow decline. And I remember thinking, even then, before anything had gone wrong, something about this doesn't add up. I was right. I just didn't know how wrong it actually was, or how far my sister was willing to go, or that it would take my grandmother's own quiet suspicion, and a private investigator's report sitting in a lawyer's locked drawer, to finally prove it. This is the story of how a lie about a baby that never existed almost cost me everything my grandmother spent her whole life building. And how, in the end, the truth came out in the one room my sister thought she'd already won. I should tell you now, before I go any further, that I'm not someone who enjoys conflict. I'm the person at family dinners who changes the subject when voices start to rise, who apologizes first even when I'm not the one who did anything wrong. So when I say that watching that moment unfold in the lawyer's office felt like watching a dam finally break after months of quiet pressure, I mean it exactly that way. Nothing about what happened felt like a victory. It felt like relief and grief, arriving in the same breath, which is its own strange kind of heavy. My name is Claire. I'm 34 years old and for most of my adult life I've been the daughter, or in this case, the granddaughter, who shows up. Not the one who gets photographed at the family reunion looking effortlessly glamorous, not the one who gets toasted at holiday dinners for her big new job or her big new house. Just the one who shows up. Who remembers what day the pharmacy closes early. Who knows which pillow Nana likes under her right knee for her arthritis. I grew up in a small town about 40 minutes outside Sacramento, in a house my grandmother, Eleanor Whitfield, had lived in since 1978. She and my grandfather bought it together, raised my mother in it, and after my grandfather passed away when I was 11, Nana never left. She used to say the walls remembered him, and she wasn't ready to let a realtor's sign make her forget. My sister Vanessa is 2 years older than me. Growing up, she was the one everyone noticed first, taller, louder, funnier in that way that made rooms lean toward her. I was the quiet one. The reader. The one teachers described as conscientious on report cards, which even at 8 years old I understood was a polite way of saying, not exciting. Vanessa got scholarships to things I never even applied for. She got engaged at 24 to a man named Derek who worked in commercial real estate, and drove a car that cost more than my entire year's salary. She moved to Denver for his job, and after that, our relationship with her thinned out to holiday texts, and the occasional liked photo on social media. Our parents divorced when I was 17, and it split the family in ways that never fully healed. My mother moved out of state to be near her sister. My father remarried within 2 years. Neither of them were particularly present after that, not cruel, just absent, the way people get when they've decided their own lives need more attention than their grown children do. Nana became the fixed point. The one person in my life who didn't shift or disappear or need managing. She was steady in a way nobody else in my family had ever managed to be. So when Nana's health started declining about 4 years ago, first small things, forgetting where she'd put her glasses, then bigger things, a fall in the bathroom that put her in the hospital for 6 days. I didn't think twice about stepping in. I moved 20 minutes closer to her. I set up a schedule. Tuesdays and Thursdays after work, every Saturday, and Sunday dinners that became a ritual neither of us ever missed unless one of us was sick. I learned her medication schedule better than the home health aide did. I learned to recognize the difference between her tired voice and her something's actually wrong voice on the phone. I sat with her through 2 hospitalizations, 1 minor surgery, and more doctor's appointments than I could count, filling out the same intake forms over and over, memorizing her allergies, her blood pressure history, the exact way she liked her tea, hot but not scalding, with honey stirred in before the water, never after. None of this was a sacrifice in the way people sometimes frame caregiving, like it's some noble burden. I loved my grandmother. I loved the smell of her kitchen, the way she still kept a rotary dial phone on the wall, in case the power goes out, the way she told the same 3 stories about my grandfather every single time I visited, and I never once told her she'd already told me, because I could see how much joy it gave her to tell them. Vanessa, during those 4 years, called Nana maybe 6 times. She visited twice, once for Christmas, once for Nana's 82nd birthday, both times staying under 24 hours before flying back to Denver. I don't say this to paint myself as a martyr. I say it because it matters for what happened next. Because when my sister walked back into our grandmother's life after 2 years of near silence, she didn't walk in slowly, the way you'd expect from someone easing back into a relationship they'd let go cold. She walked in with an announcement built to detonate. She was going to have a baby. And after everything that had happened between her and Nana, a falling out years earlier over money Vanessa had borrowed and never repaid, a falling out neither of them ever fully explained to me, Vanessa said she wanted her child to know its great-grandmother. She said she wanted to make things right before it was too late. I remember watching my grandmother's face when Vanessa said that. I remember the way Nana's whole body seemed to soften, like something that had been braced for years finally let go. And I remember feeling something I wasn't proud of and didn't examine closely enough at the time, a small, cold flicker of doubt, sitting right underneath my happiness for her. To understand why that softening mattered so much, you have to understand what my grandmother's life had actually looked like before that afternoon. Nana had spent the better part of a decade slowly shrinking her own world. First it was giving up driving at night, after her eyesight started to go. Then it was giving up the garden she'd kept for 30 years, because kneeling had become too painful for her hips. Then it was giving up the church choir she'd sung in every Sunday since before I was born, because the standing during hymns left her dizzy. Each loss was small on its own, and each one she absorbed with the same quiet, matter-of-fact grace she brought to everything, but together they had narrowed her days down to a handful of rooms, and a handful of people. I was one of those people. For a long stretch of years, I think I might have been the only one who showed up consistently enough to count. So when Vanessa reappeared, offering not just her own presence but the promise of a great-grandchild, a whole new person for Nana to love, a reason to unpack the attic, a reason to imagine years ahead instead of behind, it wasn't just good news. It was, for my grandmother, something closer to a resurrection. I understood that even then, watching her face change at that kitchen table. I understood why she wanted so badly to believe it, and some part of me wanted to believe it too, badly enough that I let my own doubt sit quiet and unexamined for far longer than I probably should have. There's a version of this story where I'm the sharp-eyed one who saw through everything from the very beginning, and I want to be honest that this isn't that story. I was fooled for months, the same as everyone else. I just happened to be fooled a little less completely, and a little more uneasily, than the rest of my family. I want to be fair here, because it would be easy to tell this story as if my sister was simply a villain from the start, and that's not entirely true. Vanessa and I had a complicated relationship long before any of this happened, some of it her doing, some of it mine, some of it just the ordinary friction of 2 very different people raised in the same unstable house. She wasn't a cartoon. She was a person who had, at some point, genuinely wanted a relationship with our grandmother again. I believe that part, even now. What she did with that wanting is the part one can't forgive. I also think it's worth saying that people don't usually arrive at this kind of deception all at once. I don't believe Vanessa woke up one morning and decided to invent a pregnancy out of nothing. I think it's more likely that something smaller started it, a real financial pressure, maybe, or a real ache to reconnect, and that the lie grew because it worked, one small success at a time, until it had grown too large to walk back. That doesn't excuse what she did. It just means the truth of a person is rarely as simple as the worst thing they've ever done. The pregnancy announcement happened in March. By April, Vanessa was calling Nana twice a week. By May, she'd flown out from Denver twice, real visits this time, 3 or 4 days each, during which she stayed in my old childhood bedroom, and let Nana fuss over her the way grandmothers fuss over expectant mothers, asking about cravings, asking about names, pulling out a box of my mother's old baby clothes from the attic to see what could be saved. I want to be completely honest here, those first 2 months, I was genuinely, wholeheartedly happy. I'd missed having my sister around, even if I hadn't fully admitted that to myself before. Nana was glowing in a way I hadn't seen in years, genuinely, physically brighter, sleeping better, eating better, talking about the baby's due date the way other people talk about countdowns to a wedding. For a little while, it felt like our family was healing something that had been broken for a very long time. The cracks started small. Vanessa mentioned, almost in passing during a Sunday dinner in early June, that Derek's construction firm in Denver had lost a major client and things were tight. She said it lightly, the way you mention weather, but I noticed Nana's face change, that same soft, protective look she used to give me when I was small and skinned my knee. A week later, Vanessa mentioned it again, this time with more detail. They were behind on the mortgage, Derek was picking up extra shifts. She'd had to switch from her preferred OB to a cheaper in-network doctor because their insurance situation had changed. I didn't think much of it at the time. Financial stress during a pregnancy is common, and I had no reason yet to question anything Vanessa said. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that Vanessa had, according to what would later come out, been living apart from Derek for almost 4 months by that point. The commercial real estate job, the tight finances, even some of the details about their mortgage were, we'd eventually learn, partially fabricated or wildly exaggerated to build a narrative Vanessa needed our grandmother to believe. The turn came in late June, at a Sunday dinner I remember with unusual clarity because it was the last normal one we'd have for a long time. Vanessa arrived without Derek, again, citing his work schedule. She seemed distracted through most of the meal, checking her phone more than usual, and toward the end of dessert, she set down her fork and said she needed to tell us something. She'd had some bleeding, she said. Nothing confirmed yet, but her doctor had told her to prepare for the possibility that she might lose the pregnancy. She said it quietly, almost matter-of-factly, the way people sometimes speak when they're trying very hard not to fall apart in front of others. Nana reached across the table and took her hand immediately. I remember feeling a wave of guilt for the doubt I'd been carrying, because in that moment, watching my sister's hands shake slightly around her water glass, I believed her completely. 2 weeks later, Vanessa called Nana in tears to say she'd lost the baby. I wasn't there for that call. I heard about it secondhand, from Nana, who phoned me sobbing so hard I could barely understand her at first. I drove to her house that same night and found her sitting at the kitchen table with the box of my mother's old baby clothes still out, still folded on a chair where Vanessa had left it during her last visit, like Nana hadn't been able to bring herself to put it away. I called Vanessa myself that week, mostly out of genuine concern for my sister, and she was, convincingly, devastatingly, a person in grief. Short answers. A flat, exhausted voice. She said she didn't want to talk about the details, that it was still too raw, and I didn't push. Why would I? Nobody pushes a grieving person for medical specifics. That instinct, the very human, very decent instinct not to interrogate someone's pain, was, I'd later understand, exactly what my sister was counting on. Looking back, I can identify the small performance choices that made it so effective, even though I couldn't see them clearly at the time. She never over-explained. Grief, real grief, tends to come out in fragments, not tidy paragraphs, and Vanessa understood that instinctively. She'd trail off mid-sentence. She'd say, I don't really want to talk about it, instead of offering a full account, which reads, to anyone listening with love instead of suspicion, as authentic pain rather than a gap in a story. She let Nana fill in details herself, nodding along to whatever our grandmother assumed, rather than inventing specifics that could later be checked and contradicted. She also, and this detail didn't strike me until much later, never once cried in front of me on the phone. She cried, apparently, plenty in front of Nana. I heard about those calls secondhand, Nana's voice thick with her own tears when she recounted them to me. But with me, the sister who might ask a follow-up question, who might, out of old habit, want to come stay with her for a few days to help her through it, Vanessa kept just enough emotional distance to avoid ever being tested too closely. I offered, in fact, more than once, to fly out to Denver and be there for her. Each time, she found a gentle reason to decline. She needed space, she said. She needed to process it on her own terms. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I do now. What followed over the next 4 months was, in hindsight, one of the most carefully constructed campaigns of emotional manipulation I have ever witnessed, and I only recognized it as a campaign long after it was already working. The financial requests started small. In July, Vanessa mentioned that she and Derek had drained their savings covering medical costs related to the loss, hospital bills, follow-up appointments, a brief inpatient stay she said had been necessary because of complications. She wasn't asking for money outright. She was simply mentioning it in the specific, practiced way people mention things when they want someone else to offer before they have to ask. Nana offered within the same conversation. $4,000, wired the following Monday. I didn't find out about that transfer until August, when Nana mentioned it casually while I was refilling her pill organizer, the way you'd mention paying a utility bill. I remember the discomfort I felt, and I remember talking myself out of it immediately. Nana was a grown woman, fully capable of managing her own finances, and Vanessa had just gone through something devastating. Who was I to question a grieving mother needing help with medical bills? By September, the requests had a rhythm to them. A car repair Vanessa hated to even bring up. A late notice from a landlord after she said she and Derek had separated, this time genuinely, she claimed, because grief does that to people, and she'd had to find her own apartment on short notice. Each time, the amount grew. 4,000 became 6. 6 became 9. By the time I started actually paying close attention, in early October, I did some quiet math based on what Nana let slip in passing conversations and realized my grandmother had given my sister somewhere around $31,000 in 4 months. I want to be clear about what my grandmother's financial situation actually was, because it's relevant to how serious this became. Nana wasn't wealthy in the way people picture when they hear about inheritance disputes on television. She had the house, fully paid off, worth somewhere around $400,000. She had a modest retirement account from my grandfather's pension, some savings bonds, and a small life insurance policy. It was enough to live comfortably and leave something meaningful behind for her family, but it was not an amount that could absorb $31,000 in emergency withdrawals without consequence. I started noticing new stress in Nana's voice when she talked about her monthly budget, small comments about being more careful, about maybe not renewing a magazine subscription she'd had for 15 years. There was a particular Sunday in late September that I keep coming back to, because it's the clearest single memory I have of the machine working exactly as designed. I'd arrived early to help Nana with groceries, and I found her at the kitchen table with her checkbook open, doing the kind of careful, column-by-column math she used to do every month before her arthritis made handwriting difficult. She looked up at me and said, almost apologetically, that she might need to ask me to help cover the cost of her blood pressure medication that month, just until her next Social Security deposit came in. This was a woman who had never, in the 3 years I'd been managing her care, asked me for $1. I paid for it without a second thought, and I didn't think to ask why the math suddenly wasn't working, because I still didn't have the full picture of where her money had been going. I found out 2 weeks later, almost by accident, flipping through a stack of mail I was helping her sort, that a wire transfer confirmation from her bank had come through addressed to her, for an amount that made my stomach drop. When I asked her about it, gently, she explained, again, so naturally, so without any defensiveness, that Vanessa's car had needed a transmission repair, and without reliable transportation she couldn't get to her follow-up appointments, and what was Nana supposed to do, let her granddaughter miss doctor's appointments after everything she'd been through? I want to underscore something about how these requests were always framed, because I think it's the part that made them so difficult to challenge. Vanessa never once, as far as I'm aware, asked Nana for money directly. Not one single time. She mentioned problems. She described hardships. She let the offer come from Nana's side, every single time, which meant that anyone attempting to intervene wasn't confronting a granddaughter asking for handouts, they were confronting a devoted grandmother who simply wanted to help. It's a difficult position to argue against, and it's one I understood, even in the moment. I was poorly positioned to challenge without looking like the villain of my own family. Looking back at it now, I can map the entire escalation almost like a ledger of its own, each entry slightly larger and slightly more urgent than the one before it. $4,000 for medical costs in July. $2,200 for a car repair in August. $6,000 for a security deposit and first month's rent in September, framed around the sudden, tearful revelation of the separation from Derek. $9,000 more in October, described only vaguely as getting back on her feet, a phrase so soft and unspecific that nobody at the dinner table thought to ask what it actually meant. And finally, in November, a request that wasn't framed as a request at all, simply a comment, dropped almost casually over dessert, about how hard it was to imagine facing a first holiday season alone, without a child, without a husband, and Nana quietly writing a check the following week for another $10,000, money I only learned about by finding the carbon copy in her checkbook register months later. What strikes me most, even now, is how ordinary each individual moment felt while it was happening. No single conversation, taken on its own, would have raised alarm in anyone. It was only an aggregate, only when I finally sat down in October with a pen and paper and forced myself to add up every fragment I'd overheard or stumbled across, that the shape of the whole thing became visible. By then, the pattern was already deeply embedded in our family's rhythm. Vanessa mentions a hardship, Nana offers help, gratitude is expressed, the subject changes, and everyone moves on to dessert as if nothing significant just happened at all. I tried, twice, to gently raise the subject with her. The first time, in late September, I asked if she'd talked to a financial advisor recently, framing it as routine concern about her retirement account. She brushed it off, said everything was handled. The second time, in October, I was more direct. I asked if she was comfortable with how much she'd been giving Vanessa. Her face changed immediately, not anger exactly, but something guarded, almost embarrassed, like I'd caught her at something. She lost a baby, Claire, Nana said. I'm not going to sit here and count pennies while my granddaughter is grieving. I dropped it. I want to be honest about that because it matters. I dropped it because I didn't want to be the person who made a grieving woman's grandmother feel judged for showing compassion, and because some small, shameful part of me was afraid of how it would look, the granddaughter who shows up every week, suddenly complaining about money, right after the granddaughter who never shows up loses a baby. I could already hear how that would sound if it got repeated at a family gathering. So I stayed quiet and the requests kept coming. What I didn't know at the time, what I wouldn't learn until months later, was that my grandmother had also started to have doubts of her own. Nana was sharp, even in her 80s, sharper than most people gave her credit for once her mobility started declining and people began, unconsciously, treating her like she was less capable across the board. She noticed things. She noticed that Vanessa's stories didn't always line up exactly the same way twice. She noticed that Vanessa never wanted to discuss which hospital she'd been treated at, always deflecting with vague references to the ER, or my doctor's office. She noticed that Derek had apparently vanished from the narrative so completely that by October, Vanessa was describing herself as functionally a single woman starting over, with no mention of divorce paperwork, no mention of any formal separation timeline. In November, the request shifted from money to something bigger. Vanessa began talking in increasingly direct terms about the future, about what would happen to the house, to Nana's assets, when the time came, a phrase she used with a delicacy that I now recognize as deliberate, testing how the subject would land. She framed it around grief and fairness. She said things like, I know Claire's been amazing, and I'm not trying to take anything away from that, but I lost so much this year, and I just don't want to be forgotten because I wasn't the one showing up every Sunday." She said it to Nana in private, more than once, according to what Nana would later tell me, conversations I only learned about after everything unraveled. There was another layer to the escalation that I haven't mentioned yet, because it took me the longest to piece together, and that was the way Vanessa started, subtly, to rewrite my role in the family alongside her own. It began with small comments relayed to me through my mother, Vanessa mentioning to Nana that she'd noticed I seemed distant lately, or that I hadn't asked much about how she was coping. These comments bore no resemblance to reality. I was calling Vanessa regularly, checking in, offering to help however I could. But the comments weren't really meant to be accurate. They were meant to plant a small, recurring doubt in Nana's mind about whether I was as caring as I appeared, positioned carefully alongside Vanessa's own visible suffering. By October, I started to notice the effect of this in small ways during our Sunday dinners. Nana would ask me, almost testing, whether I'd called Vanessa that week. She'd mention, in a tone I couldn't quite place, that Vanessa had said I seemed busy with my own life. I remember sitting at that table feeling a specific, disorienting kind of unfairness, the unfairness of being quietly recast as the less devoted granddaughter by the very sister who was, at that moment, 400 miles away, constructing an elaborate story I was helping fund through my own silence. I want to say plainly that I don't think Nana ever stopped loving me during this period, or ever seriously believed I was uncaring. But grief and guilt are powerful editors of perception, and I think some part of my grandmother, aching for her grieving granddaughter, found it easier to believe that both of us needed her attention rather than confront the possibility that one of us might be lying to her completely. By late November, my grandmother's longtime attorney, Alan Pierce, received a call from Nana asking to schedule a meeting to review her will. I didn't know about this meeting when it happened. I found out about it the same way I found out about most things that fall, after the fact, secondhand, and far too late to do anything but watch it play out. What actually happened in that meeting, I would only learn much later. But the short version is this: my grandmother, sitting across from a lawyer she'd trusted for 2 decades, told him she wanted to update her will to leave a significantly larger share of her estate to Vanessa, framed explicitly around the miscarriage, around wanting to help her granddaughter recover from the hardest year of her life. She wanted to leave Vanessa 60% of the estate, including the house, with the remaining 40% split between me and a modest bequest to a local animal shelter Nana had volunteered at for years. I didn't find out about the will change until January, and I didn't find out from Nana. I found out from my mother, who'd heard about it from Nana in a phone call, and thinking I already knew, mentioned it in passing during a conversation about something else entirely. I remember standing in my kitchen, phone against my ear, feeling something in my chest go very still and very cold. I confronted Nana about it 2 days later, gently, I hope, though I was hurting in ways I hadn't expected. She got defensive almost immediately, which wasn't like her. She said it wasn't about me, that she loved me, that she trusted me, that this had nothing to do with how much I meant to her. She said Vanessa had lost something I would never fully understand, and that money couldn't fix grief, but it could at least ease it, and that she needed to do this for her own peace of mind before anything happened to her. I didn't argue. I want that on record. I didn't fight for a bigger share, didn't demand she reconsider, didn't say a single unkind word about my sister in that conversation, even though something in my gut, some old, familiar, unwelcome instinct, was telling me, quietly but persistently, that something about this entire situation didn't add up. I told Nana I loved her, that it was her money and her decision, and that nothing would change how I showed up for her. And then I hung up the phone and cried in my car for 20 minutes before I could bring myself to drive home. My grandmother passed away on a Tuesday morning in early March, almost exactly 1 year after Vanessa's original pregnancy announcement. It was peaceful, at least. She'd been declining steadily for about 3 weeks, and I was with her the night before, holding her hand while she drifted in and out of sleep, telling her one more time about the day my grandfather proposed to her at a diner that no longer exists, a story I'd heard 100 times, and would have given anything to hear 100 more. I won't dwell too long on the grief itself, because that part is mine, and it doesn't belong in a story about betrayal. What I will say is that in the days immediately after her death, While I was handling funeral arrangements almost entirely alone, Vanessa flew in only for the service itself, staying less than 48 hours before flying back to Denver, citing a job interview she couldn't reschedule. I made a quiet decision that I now recognize as its own kind of low point, even though at the time it felt like peace. I decided not to fight the will. I'd learned, through the same second-hand channels as before, that the 60-40 split I'd heard about in January had, in fact, gone through. Vanessa would receive the house and the majority of Nana's estate. I would receive a smaller portion, along with, and this detail would matter more than I understood at the time, a small wooden box Nana had specifically named to me in a handwritten note attached to the formal will, described only as the box from my nightstand, for Claire, who will know why. I didn't fight it because I was exhausted. Because I'd just lost the person who'd been the emotional center of my life for 3 decades, and I didn't have anything left in me to spend on a legal battle with my own sister over money, especially money attached to a story about a lost pregnancy that I still, despite my private doubts, didn't have any concrete reason to disbelieve. I told myself that Nana had made her choice with a clear mind, that it wasn't my place to second-guess a dying woman's final wishes, and that whatever unfairness I felt was a small price to pay for not becoming the kind of person who fights her grieving sister over inheritance money at a time like this. So I made peace with it. Or at least, I told myself I had. I started boxing up some of my things from Nana's house, items I'd left there over the years, a few books, a sweater I'd forgotten in a hall closet, under the quiet, private assumption that once the estate settled, the house would belong to my sister, and I should probably stop treating it like a place I still had a claim to. I remember standing in the kitchen one evening in late March, the same kitchen where I'd first heard Vanessa was pregnant, running my hand along the counter, and thinking that this was simply how things had ended up. Not fair. But over. I had decided, somewhere in the fog of that grief, to let it go entirely, to attend the will reading, sign whatever needed signing, and walk away from my sister's version of our family for good. I remember calling a friend from work during that stretch, someone who knew almost nothing about my family situation, and trying to explain why I wasn't more upset about the inheritance split. I remember hearing myself say, "She lost a baby, and I got to keep 3 extra years with my grandmother that she didn't get." I think I came out ahead, and half believing it as I said it. I think that's what grief does sometimes, it makes you generous in ways that aren't always healthy, because generosity feels cleaner than resentment, and resentment felt like one more thing I didn't have room to carry. There was a moment, about a week before the will reading, when my mother called to ask if I was going to say anything at the reading about how unequal the split felt. I told her no. I told her Nana had made her choice, and whatever I felt about it privately didn't give me the right to make my grandmother's final wishes into a public argument. I believed that when I said it. I still believe the sentiment behind it, even now, knowing everything I know. I just didn't yet understand that the split I was preparing to accept without complaint wasn't actually my grandmother's final wish at all. I did not know, as I made that decision, that my grandmother had made a very different one of her own, several months earlier, in a conversation with her lawyer that I wouldn't learn about until the day everything changed. The will reading was scheduled for a Thursday in early April, 5 weeks after the funeral, at Alan Pierce's small office above a bakery in downtown, the same office he'd occupied for as long as I could remember, with the same worn leather chairs and the same framed photo of his golden retriever on the bookshelf behind his desk. Vanessa flew in for it, staying at a hotel this time rather than the house, which I noted without comment. My mother attended as well, along with my father, both of them curious more than invested, since neither expected to be named in any significant way. I remember Vanessa seemed almost buoyant that morning, in a way that struck me as strange for someone attending the reading of her grandmother's will. She hugged me in the parking lot, told me she'd missed me, asked about my job like we were simply 2 sisters catching up. I remember thinking, with a small, guilty pang, that maybe I'd misjudged her these past months. Maybe grief really had made her distant and strange, and now that the hardest part was behind her, she was finding her way back to being herself. Mr. Pierce greeted us warmly, offered coffee, and once everyone was settled around his conference table, he opened a manila folder and set it in front of him without immediately opening it. That was the first thing that struck me as unusual. Lawyers I'd dealt with before simply started reading. He didn't. Before I begin, he said, I want to explain something about the process that led to the document I'm about to read, because Eleanor was very specific about how she wanted this handled. He explained that in December, several weeks after finalizing the 60-40 split that favored Vanessa, my grandmother had called him again, this time not to change the will further, but to ask him a strange, specific question. She wanted to know, hypothetically, what would happen to a bequest if it turned out to have been made under false pretenses. She didn't elaborate at first, he said, but over the following weeks, in a series of quiet, careful conversations, she told him she'd started to have serious doubts about the story surrounding Vanessa's pregnancy and its loss. I felt my whole body go still. Beside me, I noticed Vanessa shift slightly in her chair. Mr. Pierce explained that Nana hadn't gone to him with an accusation, or even really a suspicion at first, just a nagging discomfort she couldn't fully name. She'd told him about small things that didn't sit right. The way Vanessa always seemed to have a new detail ready whenever an old one was questioned, but never any paperwork to go with it. The fact that in nearly a year, Nana had never once been given a hospital name, a doctor's name, or an address she could send a sympathy card to. The fact that when Nana had gently offered, back in the fall, to fly out to Denver herself to help Vanessa recover, Vanessa had deflected so quickly and so completely that Nana said it had left an odd, cold feeling in her chest for days afterward. She told me, Mr. Pierce said, glancing briefly at his notes, that she kept telling herself she was being a paranoid old woman. Her words, not mine. She said grief makes people behave strangely, and she didn't want to punish Vanessa for grieving in a way that simply looked unfamiliar to her. But she also said that something about the strangeness never fully went away, no matter how many times she talked herself out of it, and eventually she decided that loving someone doesn't mean refusing to ask questions. It means asking them carefully, and being willing to live with whatever the answer turns out to be. Mr. Pierce continued. My grandmother, it turned out, had done something none of us knew about, something that, looking back, was so entirely in character for a woman who'd spent decades running a household budget down to the penny and noticing when a grocery receipt didn't add up. She'd hired a private investigator. Not out of malice, Mr. Pierce was careful to say, but out of what she'd described to him as needing to know the truth before I go, one way or the other, because if I'm wrong about this, I want to apologize to her properly, and if I'm right, I need to protect Claire. The investigator's findings, compiled in a report Nana had requested be sealed with the estate documents and revealed only at the formal reading, were laid out in the folder Mr. Pierce now opened. He didn't read every detail aloud, he was careful, even then, about dignity, but he outlined the core findings clearly enough that no one in that room could mistake what they meant. There was no record of Vanessa receiving prenatal care at any obstetric practice within a 50-mile radius of her Denver address during the period she claimed to be pregnant. There was no hospital record of an emergency room visit or inpatient stay during the week she claimed to have suffered the miscarriage. The apartment she claimed to have moved into after separating from Derek had, in fact, been leased under her name alone 8 months before the pregnancy was ever announced, meaning she and Derek had already been living apart well before any of this began. And Derek himself, when contacted by the investigator, confirmed that he and Vanessa had separated the previous winter, that there had never been a pregnancy to his knowledge, and that he had, in fact, requested a formal divorce filing which Vanessa had been delaying for reasons he didn't understand at the time but suspected, in hindsight, were financial. The room had gone completely silent. I remember looking at my mother, whose face had drained of color. I remember not looking at Vanessa at all, because some part of me, the part that had loved my sister my entire life, the part that still, even now, wanted desperately for there to be some explanation, couldn't bring myself to watch her hear this. He described, briefly, how the investigator had been hired, a licensed professional Nana found through a referral from an old friend whose son worked in family law, someone experienced, and Mr. Pierce noted pointedly, someone thorough enough to build a report that would hold up to scrutiny rather than rely on rumor or guesswork. The investigator had started, he said, with the simplest possible verification, contacting obstetric practices in the Denver metro area, using dates Nana had been given secondhand through Vanessa's own account of her due date and her doctor visits, to see whether any record existed at all. When that search came back empty, the investigator widened the radius, then checked hospital admission records for the specific week Vanessa claimed to have miscarried, using standard public records requests and a formal authorization Nana had signed as part of hiring him. Mr. Pierce paused there, folding his hands on top of the folder. I want to say, for the record, that Eleanor was devastated by these findings. I met with her twice after she received this report, and both times she cried through most of the conversation. She loved Vanessa. This was never about punishing her. It was about making sure the truth, whatever it turned out to be, was the thing her estate was finally built around. Mr. Pierce closed the folder gently. Eleanor updated her will one final time, on January the 9th, after reviewing this report herself, he said. This is the version I'm going to read today. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Vanessa's hands were pressed flat against the conference table, and I watched her knuckles go white before she finally found her voice. This is insane, she said. You can't just, a private investigator. She hired someone to spy on me while I was grieving. She hired someone, Mr. Pierce said, with a calm that somehow made the moment feel even heavier than shouting would have, because the story didn't match what she was seeing, and she wanted to be certain before she made a decision that would affect the rest of her family. I'd add that she was, by all accounts, deeply hopeful the investigation would clear things up. She told me more than once she'd rather be wrong and embarrassed than right and silent. So what? Vanessa said, her voice climbing. You're just going to sit there and read whatever new version she wrote, based on some stranger's report, without even letting me explain. You're welcome to explain anything you'd like, Mr. Pierce said. But I have a professional and legal obligation to execute Eleanor's final, validly witnessed wishes, and that's what I intend to do. I finally looked at my sister then. I don't know what I'd expected. Tears, maybe. An apology. Some crack in the performance that would let me see the sister I remembered from childhood, the one who used to sneak me candy bars past our parents' rules, who used to let me sleep in her room during thunderstorms. What I saw instead was fear, quickly hardening into something closer to anger, the specific anger of someone who has been caught and is trying, in real time, to decide whether outrage or tears will play better. My mother was the first to break the silence after that, turning to Vanessa with a voice I'd never heard her use before, low and unsteady. Tell me it's not true, she said. Tell me right now, and I'll believe you over a stranger's report, I promise I will. It was, I think, the most honest thing anyone said in that entire room, a mother giving her daughter one last, undeserved chance to simply be honest, no evidence required, just the truth spoken plainly. Vanessa didn't take it. She looked at our mother for a long moment, opened her mouth as if she might, and then looked back down at the table instead, saying nothing at all. That silence told us more than any document in that folder ever could have. Derek is lying, she said. He's angry because I left him. He'd say anything to make me look bad. The investigator obtained medical billing records independently, Mr. Pierce said quietly. Those aren't something Derek could fabricate. Vanessa turned to me then, and for a moment I thought she might actually appeal to me directly, sister to sister, the way she used to when we were kids, and she needed me to back up a story in front of our parents. Claire, she said, you believe me, right? You know how she gets, she's been paranoid about money for years, this is exactly the kind of thing she'd. I didn't finish that sentence for her. I said as evenly as I could manage, I want to believe you. I think I wanted to believe you for almost a year. But I don't think a private investigator invents hospital records, Vanessa. I think you need to tell us the truth, right now, if there's any version of this that makes sense. She didn't answer that directly. Instead she stood up from the table, gathering her purse with hands that were visibly shaking, and said she wasn't going to sit there and be interrogated by her own family in a lawyer's office, that she needed air, that we could all talk about this later when people had calmed down. My mother reached out and asked her to please just sit back down, just for a few more minutes, but Vanessa was already moving toward the door. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment because it wasn't triumph. I'd braced myself, over the drive to that office, for the possibility that this reading would confirm what I'd quietly suspected for months, and I'd expected to feel something sharp and satisfying when it happened. Instead, I felt a strange, heavy grief for a version of my sister I'd apparently never really known, grief for the year my grandmother had spent worrying and doubting and quietly investigating her own family instead of simply enjoying her final months in peace, and grief for whatever had driven Vanessa to construct something this elaborate in the first place. I didn't say anything cruel to her. I didn't say anything at all, actually, not in that room. I reached over and put my hand briefly on my mother's arm, because she looked like she needed it more than anyone, and I let Mr. Pierce continue. The final version of the will, dated January the 9th and properly witnessed, redistributed the estate. The house and the majority of the financial assets were left to me. In recognition, the document read, in Nana's own carefully specific language that Mr. Pierce read aloud without flinching, of 3 years of daily love and care that asked for nothing in return, and which I did not fully understand the value of until I nearly gave it away to a story that wasn't true. A smaller portion, not nothing, Nana had been careful about that too, was left to Vanessa, along with a private letter Mr. Pierce would give her separately, not read aloud, which he said Nana had specifically requested remain between the two of them. Vanessa left the office without opening it in front of us. She left, in fact, without saying another word to any of us at all beyond that brief, failed appeal to me, and I haven't spoken to her since. I remember sitting in the silence after the door closed behind her, listening to my mother's quiet, ragged breathing beside me, and Mr. Pierce giving both of us a moment before he continued. He said, gently, that he understood this wasn't how anyone imagined the day going, and that he'd handled enough estates over his career to know that the truth rarely arrives at a convenient time. He said Nana had specifically asked him, when she made these final changes, to be as compassionate as possible in how the news was delivered, even to the person who had caused it, which is, I think, the most purely her instruction in this entire story. Even angry. Even betrayed. She still wanted kindness to be the last word, not cruelty. My father, who had said almost nothing through the entire reading, finally spoke up to ask what would happen next, whether Vanessa could contest the will, whether this was truly final. Mr. Pierce explained that the will had been properly executed, witnessed by 2 independent parties with Northwest connection to the estate, and that Nana had been assessed as fully competent by her physician within the same month it was signed, specifically to preempt exactly that kind of challenge. She had, it turned out, thought of nearly everything. It's been almost a year now since that day in Mr. Pierce's office, and I still think about it more often than I'd like to admit. I think about the $31,000 my grandmother gave away to a lie, money she worked her entire adult life to save, money that could have paid for a home health aide in her final months instead of relying so heavily on me driving back and forth 4 times a week. I think about the strange, private hurt of learning that my sister was capable of constructing something this elaborate, not a small lie, not an exaggeration born of genuine hardship, but a sustained, months-long performance of grief over a child who never existed. I've read Nana's letter to me, the one that came with the small wooden box she'd left specifically in my name, the one described in that early, provisional will as the box from my nightstand for Claire, who will know why. Inside it were photographs of my grandfather I'd never seen, a few pieces of jewelry that had belonged to her own mother, and a letter, handwritten in her careful, slightly shaky script, dated the same day as her final visit to Mr. Pierce's office. She wrote that she was sorry it took her so long to see clearly. She wrote that love sometimes makes people slow to notice what they don't want to be true, and that she hoped I'd forgive her for the months she spent doubting the daughter who never gave her a reason to doubt anything, while extending endless, unearned grace to the one who did. She wrote that she hoped, more than anything, that this wouldn't turn me bitter, that I'd remember the version of my sister who used to make me laugh until I cried, even if that version had, somewhere along the way, gotten lost. I don't know what happened to Vanessa's relationship with Derek in the end, whether the divorce went through, whether she ever explained herself to him or to anyone. I heard, secondhand, through my mother, that she moved somewhere in the Midwest a few months after the reading, and that's the last update I've had. I don't say that with anger anymore, or at least, not much. Mostly I say it with a kind of tired sadness, the sadness of loving someone you no longer fully recognize, and accepting that you may never get an honest account of why. My mother has tried, a handful of times, to broker some kind of contact between us, a birthday text, a forwarded photo, small gestures meant to leave a door open. I haven't closed that door entirely, if I'm honest. I don't think I'm capable of hating my sister, even now, even knowing everything I know. But I've also learned, this past year, the difference between refusing to hate someone and being willing to trust them again, and those are not the same thing at all. I told my mother that if Vanessa ever wants to reach out herself, honestly, without a script and without an ask attached to it, I'll listen. I'm not holding my breath. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes with a story like this one, and it's not the loneliness of losing my grandmother, which is its own grief entirely. It's the loneliness of realizing that for almost a year, I was the only person in my family who carried a private, unspoken doubt about my own sister, and I carried it mostly alone, because voicing it felt cruel and disloyal in a way that silence never did. I've since talked to a therapist about that particular kind of isolation, the isolation of doubting someone you love while everyone around you is fully convinced, and not having the words, or the standing, to say so out loud. It's a strange thing to grieve, but I think I'm still grieving it a little, even now. If there's a lesson in any of this, and I've turned it over in my mind more times than I can count, it's not really about money, even though money was the mechanism. It's about the particular danger of a lie built around grief, because grief is one of the only things in life that most decent people instinctively refuse to interrogate. Nobody wants to be the person who asks a grieving mother for hospital records. Nobody wants to be the skeptic in a room full of people extending sympathy. That instinct is good, most of the time, it's what makes us humane. But it's also exactly the instinct my sister understood and used, deliberately, for almost a year, against a woman who had never once, in 83 years of life, done anything to deserve being lied to by her own family. What saved us, in the end, wasn't suspicion or confrontation. It was my grandmother's quiet, patient refusal to simply accept a story that didn't add up, even while she loved the person telling it. She didn't accuse anyone. She didn't create a scene. She hired someone to find the truth, and she waited, with what I can only imagine was a heavy heart, until she had it, and then she made sure that truth would speak for itself, in a room full of witnesses, long after she herself was gone. I think about that a lot, the discipline it must have taken her, in her final months, to sit across the table from Vanessa during those last visits, knowing what she now suspected, and still choose warmth over accusation. She could have confronted her directly, and never involved a lawyer, or an investigator at all. She could have simply cut Vanessa off, quietly, and let the rest of us wonder why. Instead she built something more patient and, I think, more loving than either of those options, a process that gave her granddaughter every possible chance to tell the truth on her own, right up until the very end, while still protecting the rest of her family if that truth never came. I keep her wooden box on my own nightstand now, in the house that used to be hers and is now, somehow, mine. Some mornings I still reach for the phone out of habit, forgetting for half a second that there's no one on the other end of that number anymore who's going to ask if I've eaten breakfast yet. I think that's the part nobody warns you about, that even a story with a just ending still ends in loss. The truth came out. The right will was read. And I still miss her every single day. I've kept the kitchen mostly the way she had it, too, at least for now. The same rotary phone still hangs on the wall, disconnected from any actual service but still there, because I couldn't bring myself to take it down. I still make tea the way she taught me, honey stirred in before the water, never after, even though there's no one left to correct me if I get it wrong. Some evenings I sit at that same table where Vanessa first told us about the pregnancy, and I try to imagine what Nana must have felt, sitting there alone with her suspicions for all those months, choosing patience over accusation, choosing to find out quietly rather than confront loudly. I don't know that I would have had that kind of restraint in her position. I'm grateful, more than I can easily say, that she did. I think the last thing I want to leave you with is this: my grandmother never once, in 83 years, considered herself a particularly remarkable woman. She would have been embarrassed, honestly, by the idea that her story might end up here, told to strangers, held up as some kind of lesson. But I think there's real courage in what she did, in loving someone enough to hope she was wrong about them, while still being brave enough to find out for certain, and disciplined enough to make sure the truth outlived her, even if she wasn't there to see it land. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of your own family, your own grandmother, your own quiet grief? I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Tell me honestly, would you have made the same choice my grandmother made, or would you have confronted the lie the moment you first felt it? I think about that question more than almost any other these days, and I still don't have a clean answer. And if you want more stories like this one, true accounts of families tested by lies and eventually by justice, make sure you subscribe, because there are many more still to come.